One thing that is going to hurt you on a lathe, and that's leaving the chuck key in the chuck. Now, anyone that's done an apprenticeship or done any official training on one of these things, you will be told constantly not to leave the chuck key in the chuck until you get really annoyed about hearing it. Well, the reason is it's the easiest way to die on one of these things, because if you've got a chuck key in a chuck and it turns on, it's going to catapult straight through the ceiling, straight through my expensive camera lens, or straight through you. So everyone tells you not to leave the chuck key in the chuck. I go one further. I say never leave the chuck key out of your hand unless it's on the side of the machine. So if I keep it in my hand, I adjust the chuck, do what I need to do, then the chuck key comes with my hand, goes back there at all times. So once you get into the habit of always keeping the chuck key in your hands and not letting go of it while it's in the spindle, as you can see, I've not even done that for test reasons because it scares the hell out of me. I've had it drilled into me so much throughout my life. So chuck key does its job, then it stays in your hand, then it goes on the side. You never leave the chuck key in the chuck, even if you're adjusting it with a 4-jaw, which we'll do later in the course. So number one rule, never leave the chuck key in the chuck, ever. Now the manual lathe has lots of rotating parts. We've got those lead screws, we've got that chuck, and a lot of it is often unguarded on the manual lathe. So when we are working on the manual lathe, we must remember never to reach over that chuck when it is rotating. Maybe we have some tools on the top of the machine, but if we reach over that chuck, it's very easy to catch ourselves on those rotating parts, especially if it's unguarded. So on the back of the machine, we have our spindle, and we can put our bar through that spindle. So we need to make sure that bar is cut off to length so it doesn't overhang the back of the machine. Now, quite often you might see people using a long bar with steadies holding it. It's a very dangerous procedure. Often I've seen that bar bend and whip around, and it can even turn the machine over. It hits that hard and that fast. So we should never have any bar extruding beyond the back of the machine. Now we can get holders that go over the tube so we can extend it by maybe 3 feet or a meter or so. Now these do work, these are fine, but if you haven't got that extension bar you can attach to the machine to support that metal, you should not use any other options to do that. So as we spoke about in the previous lesson, we spoke about avoiding gloves, loose clothing, long hair, jewellery, sleeves, ties, anything that can hang down and get in the way of moving parts. So on a manual lathe, we have to be especially careful of this, because any of those things can get caught up in a moving part and drag us in very quickly. Now, often on a manual lathe, we might be tempted to use emery cloth to polish a surface, to remove that surface finish and get it better, or maybe remove the last few tenths of an inch or microns to bring a shaft down to size. Now, this was banned in a few companies that I've worked for, a few of the bigger companies. If you do decide to use emery cloth to take away those last few tenths, you have to be extremely careful. I would recommend building your own tools so you can wrap the emery cloth around something in the tool post and use that to polish your diameters. Holding the emery cloth by hand can quite often snag and drag us in. I've actually lost quite a few nails and cut my fingers many times by this happening, and it's extremely dangerous. It can drag our whole arm into that machine in a split second, especially if that tool post is near as well. So when using polishing cloths on a lathe, I recommend building something to wrap it around the tool so it's sticking out the tool post, and then use that to remove those last few tenths. Now you should never use any fingers to remove swarf or chips away from the parts on the machine. So always use a brush to remove any swarf or chips away from the machine, especially when it's running. Another thing I want to talk about is gloves. Now, these are great if you're dealing with dirty work. I've just been sawing up some bars, so they're ideal for that, to keep my hands clean when I'm working with camera equipment at least. But when it comes to a machine, you should never ever wear gloves on a machine that's working. Even though these are very thin, they can still grab on different parts of the machine, even the lead screw, and pull your hand in before you have time to react. So whenever on a machine, never wear gloves.